This is a moment in Jewish history. I am your host, Ben Bresky, and in my previous episode, I talked about Bob Dylan, who performed in Israel 3 times so far. He was also one of the performers at the 1963 March on Washington, although the event was mainly known for its closing speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I have always been interested in this event because my mother was one of the approximately 250,000 people estimated to have attended the March on Washington.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
I remember as a child showing her my history textbook, which had a photo of the march, and she pointed to the place in the crowd where she was standing. It was hard for me to believe that my mother was in the history book. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom took place on August 28, 1963, and culminated at the Lincoln Memorial, where there was a 3-hour program of speakers and performers. Most were civil rights leaders, such as A. Philip Randolph, who organized the event, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, Whitney Young Jr. of the National Urban League, and the final speaker of the day, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Several musicians were on hand as well, such as Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, and the opera singer Marian Anderson. There were 2 rabbis on stage at the Lincoln Memorial, Rabbi Uri Miller, president of the Synagogue Council of America, who gave a brief prayer.
May we ever expand the area of human freedom in our midst, and thus serve Thee and Thy law of love and justice. Banish hatred, pride, and arrogance from our midst, and inspire us to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with Thee. Hasten Thou the coming of the happy day, when the message of Thy prophets shall be fulfilled, when men shall break their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and no longer learn the art of war, when the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. Amen.
The other rabbi was Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Born in Germany, as a young man he served as a rabbi at the Friedenstempel Synagogue in Berlin. He became a popular public speaker, and his services were described as urbane, sophisticated, and unconventional. He had a Ph.D. in philosophy and was a member of the Zionist organization called Blau-Weiß, or Blue and White. In 1934, he authored the book Wir Juden, We Jews, in which he described the increasing strength of the Nazi Party. Rabbi Prinz was from a family who lived for generations in Germany, but he advocated leaving the country and advocated for Jews to immigrate to the land of Israel. During his Shabbat sermons, he often spoke out against the Nazis and was arrested for it by the Gestapo. Eventually, the Nazis forced him and his pregnant wife to leave the country. His final sermon was attended by thousands in the Jewish community, and even some Nazi officials were in attendance to monitor his words. In the United States, Rabbi Prinz continued his activism and lectured across the country about the threat of Nazism and helped raise money for Holocaust refugees. Rabbi Prinz met Martin Luther King back in 1958 when he was president of the American Jewish Congress and invited Dr. King to speak. This leads us up to that day in the summer of 1963, when he gave his memorable speech at the March on Washington.
Our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, He created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it is not merely sympathy and compassion that motivates us, born of our own painful historic experience. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life, and under those tragic circumstances, is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder.
2 years after the march, Dr. King was a guest speaker at the American Jewish Committee and referenced Rabbi Prinz's remarks.
And at the Lincoln Memorial, there was the greatest and warmest expression of religious unity of Catholic, Protestant, and Jew in the nation's history. Perhaps if there had been a broader understanding of the uses of nonviolent direct action in Germany when Hitler was rising and consolidating his power, the brutal extermination of 6 million Jews and millions of other war dead might have been averted, and Germany might never have become totalitarian if Protestants and Catholics had engaged in nonviolent direct action and had made the oppression of the Jews their very own oppression, and had come into the streets beside the Jew to scrub the sidewalks, and had Gentiles worn the stigmatizing yellow armbands by the millions, a unique form of mass resistance to the Nazi regime might have developed. I'm fully aware today people all over the world should be engaging in mass action to protest anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. That is a dangerous silence today which unintentionally encourages evil to flourish. Was Albert Einstein right when he said, "The world is in greater peril from those who tolerate evil than from those who actively commit it"? Did not President Kennedy warn that those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence? Will the nation ever forget the searing impact of Rabbi Joachim Prinz's admonition as he spoke at the March on Washington in 1963? When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned in my life and under tragic circumstances is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself.
Dr. King's reference to Soviet Jews was about what are often called Russian refuseniks. I mentioned the issue in a past podcast I did about the Freedom for Soviet Jewry rally. Russian Jews living in the Soviet Union could not leave the country and immigrate to Israel or anywhere else in the world, and those that did apply for exit visas could be fired from their jobs or arrested, and many were. Jews were restricted in other ways in terms of practicing Judaism or outwardly expressing pro-Jewish or pro-Israel sentiment or opposition to communism. Dr. King made quite a few public statements calling for freedom for Soviet Jews. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency reported in November of 1963 that Dr. King decried the Soviet government for what he called its attempt to liquidate the Jewish people in Soviet Russia. This kind of spiritual annihilation, this attempt to engage in a systematic spiritual liquidation, is something we must not allow, Dr. King stated. There's much more that could be said about Dr. Martin Luther King, Jewish Americans, Israel, and other Jewish leaders who participated in civil rights rallies, but that is a story for another time. If you were at the March on Washington, or have a relative that was, like me, send me an email and check out my past shows at benbresky.substack.com. Thank you for listening, and shalom.